Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen O'Connell with the New York Times in College. I would like to welcome all of you here, either in person or over the web. We are thrilled to be partnering with the International Leadership Association on our panel discussion about intergenerational leadership. We will be taking questions, so feel free to participate in the conversation. If you would like to ask a question and you're joining us virtually, please type it in, and I will be taking those to the moderator. I would now like to introduce Michael Hoden, the Executive Director of the Global Coalition on Aging. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We're delighted as well to be partnering with the International Leadership Association and the New York Times. This partnership, Eliane knows, started about a year ago in Berlin when we had the International Leadership Association meeting where we started focusing on the topic of population aging. And I guess we have a conference coming up in Montreal in October. So that's a global conference that hopefully everyone will be part of, contribute to. But you know, the point that came out in Berlin, which we will continue through today, including the audience here. This is one of the younger audiences that I've seen in this population aging topic, which is fantastic and exactly right. So let me tell you why. Some of you may know Dr. Sarah Harper, who runs something called the Institute on Aging at Oxford University. Sarah gave the London-Oxford lecture last year. Now, the fact that the London-Oxford lecture was dedicated to aging in itself is significant. One of Sarah's interesting points was she said a young girl born in the 1990s is likely to see 3 centuries. So the point about this population aging is it's a demographic transformation. The combination of living longer, low birth rates all over the world, our construction of population in the 21st century is different than it ever has been before. And therefore, the idea about how a person in their 20s or 30s will live their life in the 21st century is utterly critical. And that's what this topic is really about. And that's why I really applaud the ILA for understanding this intergenerational concept and what aging population is really about. So let me then go quickly and introduce the panel, starting with Eliane Obaljoro, who we're delighted to have you, an adjunct professor at McGill University Institute for the Study of International Development, chair of ILA's Global Conference, which, as I said, will be in Montreal. Advertisement here, October 30 to November 2nd, so we hope everyone will join. Next, Ruth Finkelstein. Dr. Finkelstein is a senior VP at the New York Academy of Medicine, which in itself is a great notoriety, but even more so, Ruth is the genius behind and in front of New York City age-friendly program. And New York City age-friendly city program is actually one of the heralded programs of its kind globally. And I know Ruth will talk about that, but the New York Academy of Medicine, Ruth in particular, has done a spectacular job, and we can see it all around us in the city. Andrew Hank, who we just met the other day, and it's nice to see you again, Andrew, program coordinator at World Vision International, Christian Relief Development and Advocacy Organization, an active member of ILA, and again, very importantly, we're delighted to see chair of the new ILA Youth Leadership Membership Group. And so your interest in this demographic transformation is great. And David Tyree, who's an old friend. David, it's great to have you here. Director and head of personal wealth and retirement at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, responsible for some of the great innovative programs that are taking place at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And we think at the Global Coalition on Aging, of which Bank of America is a member, we're delighted, that it's really about this intergenerational planning around financial matters, around education, around wellness. And if we get that right, it's going to be a great 21st century. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sam and take over the panel.
All right. Thank you. I think I'm mic'd up, so I'm going to put this down on the floor, Marco Rubio style, out of the frame. I'm Sam Sifton. I'm the national editor of the New York Times, and I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon in person and on the web to moderate this discussion of intergenerational leadership, the challenges of a shifting workforce. I'd like to take a minute just before we get started to talk to our webinating friends in the inner tubes well beyond this room. One of the things that I loved discovering when I became a journalist was that the White House briefing room is really much smaller than it appears on television. That is the case here as well. It may seem that we're in this giant auditorium, but we're not in a giant auditorium. We were really quite uncomfortably close to the back wall of this room. But it's great to have you wherever you are in the wide world of the web with us. So I'd like to outline what we're going to do here over the course of the next X number of minutes. And first, what I want to do is let you know why exactly you're here, what we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to return to our panelists here and have them tell us a little bit about who they are, what it is they do, and why it matters to this discussion. We're going to go beyond the titles and into the actual work that they do and how that's going to help us discuss what's going to be very soon a really, totally, fully intergenerational workforce. This world is changing. America is changing, and quite quickly. We're here today to talk about that, to talk about population aging and the effect that it has and will have on you, young people far away on the web, our future leaders. Here's what most people believe. There are going to be more old people. More old people is going to lead to greater financial burdens for all of us. More old people is going to lead to financial drains on the nation's healthcare system, on Social Security. It's going to lead to very big issues in long-term care. But this is, I think we're going to argue, the wrong way to look at it. I think this is the message of the panel today. We're going to try and create a new, different discussion of population aging, one that reflects these profound demographic changes that we're undergoing in the 21st century. Because the way we talked about work and aging and retirement in the 20th century, those of us, our parents, or, sorry, your grandparents on the web, that's all losing relevancy today. It's over. The leaders of the next few decades in America and across the world are going to have to deal with a global reality that sees poor and middle-income nations swell with young people, while emerging and high-income countries like our own swell with the old, even as lifespans stretch longer and longer. So, how will these demographic trends influence our leadership at local levels, at global levels? That, I think, is what we're going to try and tackle today. You on the web are the future. You, some of you in this room, are going to need to reinvent the way we look at education, the way we look at work, the way we look at politics, the way we look at our society itself, because the society itself will have been transformed by these demographic changes. That's going to require great leadership, and that's what we're going to try and tackle today. So why don't we turn to our panelists and get a little more acquainted with them. Shall we start with you, Eliane?
So my name is Eliane Bellagero. I'm based in Montreal. I'm a professor of practice at McGill. I'm also a member of the Presidential Advisory Council of Rwanda, and I've been on that council since 2007. I'm a molecular geneticist by training. Leadership has been something that I discovered in relation to the past, tragic past of my country, Rwanda, in terms of what does leadership do, what can it do, and what are the depths of horror, but also what is the greatness and the sacredness that leadership can bring to what humanity can do to this earth. And so what I'm here for is really looking at how our interconnectedness can be used to move humanity in a more peaceful, more sustainable way forward.
Oh. Thank you. My name is Ruth Finkelstein, and I, as Mike said, run the Age-Friendly New York City initiative, which is part of the global network of age-friendly cities, which is animated by the perception that we have a choice in how we conceptualize the fact that the world is aging. And how we conceptualize it in the first place makes a huge difference about what our responses are. So if we conceptualize aging as a disaster and a tsunami, it will surely be one. If instead we conceptualize the aging of the population as an opportunity and older adults as an asset, and the interaction between the generations as generative, and the opportunity to build something new and different that we've never seen before, that may be able to avoid some of the perils of the past and create a new future, then indeed aging can be an opportunity. Over the course of this conversation, we'll move beyond those sort of platitudes and rhetoric to talk about specific ways that a multi-generational workplace, for example, is a better workplace for each of the generations, and there are concrete and specific ways to make this so.
My name is Andrew Hank, and I serve as the internship program coordinator at World Vision International, one of the world's largest NGOs. I'm based in Pasadena, California, so greetings from the West Coast, especially to those on the webcast as well. It's a privilege to be a part of this important conversation, one that involves generations, young and old, and in between. It's a privilege to be a part of these topics that we're going to discuss today, not just aging, as Ruth mentioned, but really kind of the deeper implications here of a changing workforce, but also our changing understandings of how we work based on our generational differences, but also our similarities that I think are more prevalent than we think. My own life experiences have shaped my approach as to where I come from today, these issues as well as that we'll discuss today. I am a millennial. You may think highly of millennials, you may not think highly of millennials, but I am a millennial.
Should I move over?
Sure. Stay close, you're good. I've been a part of the full-time working world for 4 years, just 4 years. And when I graduated from college in 2009, I know there's a lot of college students on the webcast today. When I graduated in 2009, it was just that previous fall, obviously, when the world economic recession was such a huge reality for students like myself, hoping to find a job out of college. And I was very fortunate to do so. A week after my college graduation, I had a crash course in this conversation that we're having today of intergenerational collaboration in the workplace, when my baby boomer assistant asked me how old I was. You may wonder, what was my answer? And I said, it's not an issue, because we're going to move on. This conversation of age, this conversation of generations, I think is an important one, especially for the new realities in terms of work structures and work cultures, because millennials are joining the workforce at record rates, just as baby boomers are going to be retiring at record rates here. So there's going to be some important conversations, difficult conversations to have, that I think are going to impact the realities of our organizations, but also society at large. And so I hope today the conversation can move not just from our organizations appreciating being multi-generational, but rather having a conversation of how we can become intergenerational, that it's not based on systems young versus old. It's not based on systems based on position. You have to have X amount of years of experience or education to reach this point in the organization. I think these are impactful conversations that we have been having in the ILA, and I'm looking forward to today here on this panel.
Let's go to Gen X.
Hit it.
I'm actually the last class of boomers, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
I am. If we're putting labels on ourselves. My name is David Tyree, and I am the head of personal wealth and retirement at Merrill Lynch. And really excited to be up here on this panel, because I think what you've heard from each and every one of them in their introductions is it's not about the what, it's about the why. And that's what's so exciting and so invigorating, to actually get under the covers and start thinking about, what does this mean? And what kind of responsibility does every single person in the room, whether it be personal or be a representative of an organization, have to commit to do this? I'll put it in perspective from my vantage point. I started off in financial services 26 years ago. And when I first started there as somebody in financial services, I used to hear bosses say, our job is to take care of other people's money. That's pretty admirable. I sit And I tell folks that are part of my organization, our job is to help people live the very best lives in retirement. It's a big difference there. And it all of a sudden takes the microscope off of one thing and makes it very, very broad. So I spend as much time thinking about the things that some of our other panelists do, even though I don't have those things like health in my title, as other. The numbers are undeniable, and they're absolutely 100% predictable. 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every single day. I can give you the numbers all day long, but the question is, what does that actually mean? And how are we going to attack it? So I'm really excited to hear a little bit from our panelists and also contribute to what that actually means.
Well, terrific. So now you know who you're dealing with. I'm clearly the one who doesn't know anything. So I'm going to start by asking the questions. Well, I'm going to ask a series of questions. We're going to kind of see how those questions are answered by our panel. And that's going to lead, I hope, to some very good questions from you. I'd like to start, if it's okay, in the workplace, since this came up a great deal. Already, even in a sort of pre-super-aging society, we see the tensions, even on this stage, of being a young worker, being a millennial, being a Gen Xer, a boomer, what have you. The question that I would like to lead with has to do with our younger viewers out in the audience, and both here in the building and farther. What do these young people about to graduate from college need to know about going into a workplace where people are going to be working much longer, both because of their age and perhaps because of their financial need? A 6-decade career in the newspaper business, well, it's frankly a terrifying notion, but but it might happen. So as these college students graduate out into the workplace, and perhaps into a 6-decade career, what do they need to know? David, should we start with you, since and then we'll work backwards?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, I think the most important thing to understand is accountability, in my perspective and my view, has taken on a whole new kind of definition. We're all accountable. And when we start thinking about this long lives that we're going to live, you've got to be accountable for those. And there's not any one given point. It wasn't one decision. It's going to be your whole life of decisions that you have to think about. And those decisions have to actually be informed. And if you take lessons from the shift that Michael talked about, right? And just take the baby boom shift and the 76 million boomers now, more and more coming on every single day. You think about the shift that they've gone through. The world that we have known in the past was one of two promises, really. Come work for a company and be a great employee. I'm going to give you a pension. And here's a number, and you like that number, and you're going to get it for the rest of your lives. Right? There's promise one. If you're a good U.S. citizen and you pay your taxes, don't worry about health care. We got that piece covered. That system ain't here anymore, folks. It's gone. You have to figure out this for yourself. That promise is no longer there. And I see that trend for the younger generation is really, really meaningful. It is I've got to think about these things they're farther in the distant, but I've got to start thinking about these things now and plan. So this whole notion of how you plan, I'm not talking about financial planning, I'm talking about life planning, and making these decisions that impact. And one piece that we've also learned is that the best safety you can have in this new world of planning is connections. Connections with family, connections with friends. Those are taking on a much, much more meaningful component of how I think and how I plan. So it's the connections and the planning that I think are going to be the big life lessons that we take away.
I'm going to jump over to Ruth for a second.
So when I was young, we had this image of the life course, that you sort of spent your first third of your life in education, the second third of your life in work, and the last third of your life in retirement. This couldn't be more dysfunctional. We were wrong about all of it. The message I would give to youth now is to recognize that education, work, and pursuit of the other dimensions of life need to be interspersed throughout your life and your life cycle. The idea of deferring each one until you finish the next one is a mistake of great magnitude and is to the detriment to all of us. We need, and people have told us that they need, to be open, available, and have education accessible to them over and over again throughout the life course. During your main working years, women and men too need to be able to turn attention and priority away from being exclusively in the paid workforce and also into familial responsibilities and community responsibilities and leadership responsibilities. And older adults have a huge amount to contribute to society in the education, through delivering education, through leadership, and through work. So we have to take those boundaries away and make a life course that is comprehensive of all those dimensions of living.
With the American dream now in tatters, I'm going to shift to a more global viewpoint, if you wouldn't mind, Eliane.
Well, when I went to university 24 years ago, I thought, I'm coming to North America, I'm going to get my degree.
3 years old?
See, there's the issue of generations, intergenerational, and then there's the youthfulness. Youthfulness can betray a lot of things. And so what I thought is I'd come, get my degree, go home, and work in Rwanda. And during my undergraduate, things exploded in my country, and I had to decide, well, how am I going to contribute to the world? I had a plan, and my plan has to shift because reality is shifting much faster than I had anticipated. And so when I look at youth today, and I see at McGill, in our program in international development, we have 1,200 students. They come to me and they want to change the world. And they're like, Eliane, what do I need to do? And one of the things that's really critical to me that we've put in the theme of ILA's global conference this year is leadership for local and global resilience. And it's the idea that you don't need to leave where you are to make a change. And so that change can happen in your family, it can happen in your community, in your schools, it can happen elsewhere as well. And wherever you're learning, whatever experience life brings to you, take it on, bring in the wisdom, and allow that to help you move forward and enrich the conversations you have with all generations.
Andrew, you have, by my calculations, 70 years in your career left. David has told us that you need to be planning right now for the 68th year, and because it's going to be very close to the end of your career in 68 years. And that seems very daunting to me. As the product of a dissolute period in my 20s, I wonder, this seems to be a great deal of pressure that is being placed upon the millennials because of our efforts to improve science so we can let you live longer, but now you have to live longer. What's that going to be like?
I think it's incredibly humbling for my generation to realize the reality of the changed world that we live in. I think obviously the dynamics at play between the economy, between work, between finding a job. I think I know the recession is turning a bend, but it's still difficult for individuals in my generational cohort to find a job. But I think from that aspect, I think the reality of stress is clearly evident, I think, across the generational spectrum, but especially among millennials. A recent study from the American Psychological Association just released recently found that. And so I can't help but wonder if the reality of the last 4 to 5 years and the changed economic situation of the world, what kind of long-term effects that will have when millennials are to the lifespan and the life development realities that boomers are at right now. So I think that verdict's still out. But I think the challenge to bring in David's work and David's sphere is to realize that planning is important, but when you can't even see 6 months down the road as a unemployed millennial, there's various things that come into play that would be greater value for myself as a millennial, greater value for David as a boomer, someone else as an Xer, what have you. So keeping in mind those priorities, but also keeping in mind that millennials today are becoming adults later in life. The school of thought behind emerging adulthood is one of great interest to me. Dr. Jeffrey Arnett out of Clark University is one of the leading thinkers in this area. But the point in which millennials are identifying themselves as fully sustainable adults is becoming later. So it's not just 18 years old, graduate from high school, I go on to get a job, I go on to raise a family, buy a house. These kind of rites of passage of my parents' generation, of my grandparents' generation, are no longer reality today.
This gets to a point that I'd like to address on a number of different levels, because it has to do with cultural understanding, it has to do with stereotyping, it has to do with culture shifts. In this newfound world that we are going to live in, if all of a sudden it's okay to be 27 and living in mom's basement because you haven't achieved your adulthood yet, and likewise, is it then okay to be 47 and listening to hip hop at work? What is middle age if you can live to be 120? What is a rite of passage into adulthood? And we're gonna start again with David because of the necessity for planning in this, if that's okay with you, David. Sure. Can we ventilate this a little bit? Yeah. When must people begin to plan? I cannot believe that I have now become my father to say, but Andrew, you have to plan now. It's not okay. When does adulthood begin?
Well, let me just set the context for something that my fellow panelists just talked about, and they each said this is nonlinear. Yeah. I think that's the future. The future is this is not linear. It's not a sequence of events that grow. And I have a good friend in the back of the room, Michael Netter, who's probably one of the most brilliant strategists around what is the impact of the boomer generation. And once he said to me, we were talking about this notion that it's no longer, I'm going to go to work for a company, I'm going to hit my 65th birthday, and I'm going to move down to Florida, and I'm going to go on a cruise, and I'm going to get old, right? That's the way it was before. This is a generation that's living 30 years extra. These are bonus years. The optimism, they're bonus years.
Right.
He said to me once, if you have these 30 extra years, would you tag them on at the end? You're going to get old and now I want 30 more years of this? Right. No, you're going to spread them out. And I think that's what this new generation is really going to define for us, that it's going to be planning not for some 65th birthday and what the vacation's going to look like and where home is. It's planning actually shorter periods of time. It's what am I doing now? How am I going to be relevant? Hey, I don't like this job. I'm going to switch. I got to go back to school. And so school might not be the grad school and then I'm set to go. It might be I'm off in the working world for 6 or 7 years and I decide I don't like this and I'm going back because I got 70 more years of this.
So, Ruth, if I can jump to you for a second. So let's imagine the national editor of the New York Times leaving his job, spending 6-7 years as a bonefish guide in the Bahamas. I'll leave business cards around, and then now I feel like really I should go back into the workplace. This presumably will be happening much more often. People coming in, going out, returning to school, not always in pursuit of professional development, but perhaps a personal fulfillment. How are future bosses going to deal with this? How is corporate culture going to deal with people coming in and out?
Corporate culture has to change. Corporate culture is changing. Corporate culture isn't changing fast enough. There are multiple challenges to our past conceptions of what the workforce was. The workforce is becoming more diverse in every possible way. It's not becoming more diverse fast enough in relationship to the global talent in the world, but it's becoming more diverse in every possible way. As managers and bosses, we have to recognize that there are multiple routes to and paths to excellence. We have to recognize that life experience and maturity brings a skill set and a depth of understanding and a talent bank that is different than you get from a brand fresh innovator who's never seen anything before in their lives and so can look at the world through all new eyes. And our challenge is to make teams and groups and opportunities for those strengths to synergize and work together. And that needs to be true in the workplace. It needs to be true in that educational setting where you're going to go suddenly. You know, schools and universities consider anyone over 24 an older student. So you can only imagine what my mother at 85 receives, for receptivity when she goes back to school, as she does regularly, and as each of us have and will. So we have to change our understandings of the value proposition of people, and age is just one dimension of that.
Right, but you're still going to end up with 57-year-olds looking for work, and that culture change. I'm interested in how we as a nation are going to be able to make a cultural shift so that the resume of a 57-year-old who's been out of the workforce for 3-4 years for various reasons, perhaps due to personal vision, perhaps due to long-term unemployment, how they get back in is going to become increasingly important to discuss as we move forward as people stay in the workforce for longer, right?
Absolutely. And 57 is mid-career.
That's scary.
Yeah.
to me. So let's go back to education for a minute and to our friends in the interwebs. How then, if we're going to be in education our whole lives, if we're going to come in and out of the university, on and off the ivory tower, how do we think of that undergraduate period, that 4-year period? Is it a 4-year period?
It usually is a 4-year period, but I think the way to look at how we decide to move forward is what is it at this time in my life I want to be experiencing. And when I look at different undergraduate students, some are actively working while they're studying, some are exclusively studying, some will go away every summer abroad, some will be working at the same place every summer and will build that capacity to move into a specific job. And I think it's to open to the multiplicity of opportunities that exist and to harness those opportunities, because it's not just about getting that degree. It's about what do you experience while you're getting that degree. And there are phenomenal opportunities for students around the world to get opportunities locally and globally and experience really different things that will allow them to bring that knowledge and that new capacity to listen, new lenses of looking at the world, so that they can contribute more effectively to bringing about positive change.
Andrew? Yes, absolutely.
I think exactly, just to segue, the opportunity to learn experientially from what you're learning in the classroom, I think it pays dividends in the future, but also gives the opportunity for organizations to locate talent, as Ruth talked about, as in terms of especially young professionals, new professionals, emerging professionals that may not have that idea as to what they want to be, what they want to do, what career, sector, industry for that matter, they want to be a part of 10, 15, 20 years out. Part of the reason I love my job at World Vision is because I get to manage our internship programs and to help create those meaningful learning experiences for new and emerging professionals that have expressed interest in an NGO like World Vision in the nonprofit sector. And we create 3 to 6 month opportunities for them to come into the life of the department, working side by side with colleagues from across the generational spectrum who are experts in their field, learn as much as possible, and get that experience to decide, is this a direction I'd like to go in? If not, let me help. Let me help you look broader. But I think earlier, to Ruth's point, in terms of corporate culture, I think we've got to start developing teams and atmospheres in which risk is encouraged, where students and new professionals can come into the life of an organization and give their all and give a fresh perspective to the life of a team, to the life of a work group, especially in a global context. What great opportunities to give forth fresh ideas and fresh perspectives, but also see if that turns into a future career. But I think also our ideas of careers are changing. I think a stigma of stereotypes that was mentioned earlier in terms of millennials is the average tenure for my cohort is 1.5 years. And to some, the hands go up when they see that and they hear that, because people, my grandfather, my father, they were in jobs for 30, 40 years. The same job, they didn't change. And so from my perspective, I see that as a great opportunity to expand my skills and to expand my experiences, but also to change as life changes, as has already been mentioned by several on the panel, because the world is only going to continue to change faster.
David, what do you see?
I think there are a couple changes that I'm watching. Number one is that I think that in the corporate space, you're evaluating individuals differently. I think that, at least in the world that I live, a big part of it is valuing, the individual, and are they passionate about it? Do they want to do this? Can they convey ideas? Are they going to make a difference? And those aren't things that you learn in school, right? Those are kind of the nature of the person themselves. So that's kind of the prerequisite to get through the doors on that front. And I think that schools are starting to adapt to that. And I think that, we talked earlier about this linear world. Well, the school system and education has been a linear world preparing people. That's changing as well on that. I recently was talking to the director of a program called Midcore, and it's a program that's out of Middlebury College up in Vermont. And what they do is they take their students, and for 4 weeks, they take them off campus and they immerse them in things like risk-taking, presentation skills. They have a whole session, 3 hours worth of how do you walk up to somebody at a cocktail party who you want to talk to and engage in a conversation? How do you pick up the phone? Not type an email, but how do you actually pick up the phone and talk to somebody? So we're talking about these just basic building blocks that are out there. And I think that, if you start looking at the world being longer, more opportunistic, I think you're going to see much more value put on some of those basic components in preparing people for this, because they're more valued in the workplace.
And presumably those skills would be used not simply to advance one's own career, but to work within this intergenerational workplace, right?
I mean, isn't that what we're all talking about here?
Yeah.
What we're talking about is the fact that, we're living longer, healthier lives, hopefully, and there's more of us, a whole lot more of us. And guess what? It's not just, 65 to 70-year-olds. We're talking about people who are spanning the spectrum. And if it's not linear, you better learn how to get along with everybody around you.
So, Ruth, can you talk a little bit about how this is playing out in New York City, where we live?
Oh, I can think about my office, and I'm looking in the audience, and I have staff members here in their 80s and 20s, as it turns out, in the room.
The same is true downstairs in the newsroom.
Right. And what's true, so thank you for coming. The same is true around the city. Right now, today, there are 700,000 New Yorkers over 55 who are working as we speak in New York City. So it's not about a future aging workforce. It's about a currently aging workforce. And luckily, in those same places, there are also people a generation older than those 55-year-olds and 3 generations younger. So what's really going on? What's really going on is that employers are challenged. This does not all go without saying. We have to think about the age diversity of our workplace in the same way that we have to think about those other diversities. And we have to think about training in different communication styles. Just as you mentioned, we've got some generations for whom the phone is a new piece of equipment, and other generations for whom it's a new piece of equipment. So we've got to bridge that gap. We have to take incredibly seriously the way that the computer and the use of the computer has already changed the world. And the idea that we can just write off a generation and say, well, they're never going to learn that one, is simply false. You can't get along in the world without being minimally functional on the computer. And this becomes our shared responsibility as a society. We need it in the workplace, but you need it to develop the pictures that you see. You need it to get your benefits from the government. You need it to apply for a job. You need it to contact your utility company. The digital divide has to stop. So that's one very important sort of location of conflict at the workplace. But luckily, research is very clear that, contrary to the cliche, old people learn just fine, in the same way that young people learn just fine. And they can be mutually beneficial and learn from one another because they have skills and experiences that each other needs. Some are social, some are behavioral, some are relational, and some are sort of skill-based. And what we need to do is address our sort of prejudices and attitudes that are the sort of misconceptions we have about each other that make barriers to our being able to learn from each other.
Should the government itself have a role in moderating that relationship?
Oh, no, they are not doing so well with their existing roles. I'm thinking, if they handle it as well as they do the budget, no.
I mean, I raise it because one wonders, I'm a little nervous to let us simply talk on and on as if it were only corporate culture that is going to lead us in the direction that we need to go to face a workforce and a population that has such a wide age range within it. The brass tacks are often, at least for now, older workers are more expensive, younger workers are cheaper. We've talked a number of times about internships. The Times has run stories about people caught in an internship wheel where tons of years go by where you're giving your best work to a company that is giving you a place to sit during the day and nothing else. And if you get hit by a bus, that's on you. Is there a degree to which some of what we've been talking about on this panel today leads to a world in which we really are entirely on our own and responsible for our own present and future?
One of the things that's coming for me is working in international development, where I work in a lot of countries where most of the population is under 30 years old, and in some cases under 15. And so there's a dire need of older generations to contribute everything they've learned to local growth. And so in my example, my family, there's barely anybody over 50 in my family. And so I get excited about meeting everybody over 50, because I'm just hungry for the knowledge that I can gain from more experienced people. And there are various associations of, in Canada, for example, of people who've been in the civil service and who want to contribute to helping other places in the world. So it's not that they necessarily want to get a salary, but they want to get some social capital. They want to know that they're helping in the world, and they know that they have expertise that can help elsewhere. And I think one of the things we need to look at is, how do we allow knowledge, wisdom to flow in this interconnected world where computers are moving and helping us connect all over in ways that we never thought we would be connecting to. But I think also at the same time, it's realizing that what we think we're seeing for the first time isn't really happening for the first time. Anytime there's a disaster or crisis in the world, people start over. And one of the things I've done in Montreal, in conjunction with the Montreal Holocaust Museum, is bring young Rwandan genocide survivors in dialogue with Holocaust survivors. And the conversation has a richness that, for me, the first time it happened was totally unexpected in terms of, well, how do you talk to somebody who says, I came to Canada with $1 or $10, you know, really nothing in my pocket. My whole family had been killed. And now I'm a grandfather. I go swimming every day, so I'm keeping my health. I'm going to schools talking about what my experience was in Auschwitz. And here I am, and I am excited and passionate about life and humanity. And so I think what we have to realize is that how do we create spaces to listen to each other more so we can learn from each other?
But at the same time, how do we avoid a world in which you spend the years 21 to 31 as an intern and 61 to 75 as a volunteer? Right? David, can you help us?
Is the volunteer part of your plan? I think that's all personal choice, right? You know, I mean, somebody might be saying that, you know, if I'm at some point I want to go away and do this volunteer work. And the question becomes, are you prepared for that? Or are you not prepared for that? And so that's where it comes back to the planning. It comes back to the connections and those type of things. And, you know, I think that part of what I hear here are that connection becomes so much more important in the future, and the network that you build and the reliance that you have on the people you choose to be around you. Those are things to really value and to make sure that you have a strong network in there. And you have different experiences. You know, we just heard, you know, it's about how you interrelate with people. And, you know, the better you do that, the more optimistic you have. I think one of the things I was telling you is that I think that the experiences that folks can have today, in my view, are ones that are very different and valued very differently. I was telling you earlier, I have 4 kids. I have a 15-year-old who tomorrow is getting on a plane and going to Romania to volunteer at an orphanage taking care of infants. I sure wasn't doing that at 15. I would never even have thought of doing that at 15. But from my perspective, that's kind of the world we're now living in, where those kind of experiences are so critical for the future of her and what she thinks she's going to be doing.
And available to her because of your smart planning. So if I'm sitting in a dorm room somewhere and just outside of Miami, maybe I'm at Florida International, and I'm watching this up here, what's the one piece of financial planning advice you could give a college student today that might someday allow her daughter to fly off to Romania?
Well, fortunately, I'm not paying for my daughter flying off.
So that's the advice.
She was selected as part of that, but, so I can't take the planning compliment too long. But I think that you have to not think about it as financial planning. I think you have to think about it as life planning. And from my perspective, it is, you got to start early. That's what it all boils down to, is you start tapping into, you know, somebody who's been there before and what would you think about, et cetera. But from my perspective, if you're really going to push me into the bucket of the financial side of things, is make it a priority. Make it a priority. You got to start.
Right into the camera, we say.
Yeah.
Make it a priority. Okay, so it seems to me that the message of this panel thus far, and I hope you agree in the audience here and far away, is that what we're facing here is a real opportunity. I mean, being a cynical journalist, I've outlined some challenges, but you guys have offered us a lot of opportunity. Let's drill into those opportunities a little bit. More than simply, it's great when the young can speak to the old. It's great when people across cultures can realize that everything has happened in some way before, as you were saying. In terms of creativity, in terms of corporate creativity, in terms of the work that is available to us, what's out there in the future? Andrew, you want to tell us a little bit from your perspective?
I think there's a lot of opportunity whenever, as you mentioned, for lack of a better word, when young and old can come together and successfully collaborate. I think that's an important thing, but a challenging thing. It's important to recognize that it is a challenge to get beyond our stereotypes, to get beyond our own lenses, our own experiences, to consider other viewpoints, other perspectives outside of our own. I sit in our global HR team at my organization, and truly this conversation internally has become a diversity issue for us. And so I think that's a challenge for upcoming HR professionals, is to consider not just age as a diversity issue, but what does the generational spectrum present to the HR function of an organization? What richer conversations, what better product could come, what better effectiveness could come when we truly consider having a workforce across the spectrum. In terms of creativity, I think, again, to the stereotypes and the stigmas, the technology piece, I think, is said and sometimes I think oversaid, because I think it transcends generations. It's not just a young thing. I mean, Ruth spoke earlier about the young and the old mastering technology and learning how to use the computer and taking the opportunity to use social media for the betterment of organizations. There are countless studies coming out in terms of the growing numbers of senior citizens who are appearing on the social media scene. And so I think it's important to move beyond those, but also capitalize those as vehicles for us in terms of organizations to creatively think together.
Oh, yeah?
Well, one of the things that came up for me is two particular cases. There's an NGO called the 1 Acre Fund in Kenya that was funded by a young American who had gone to volunteer in South Africa and felt so much frustration around what he was trying to do in health and the reality that people needed incomes. And so he created this organization that now gives fertilizer, quality seeds in East Central Africa to farmers, and has actually allowed them to increase their incomes by 5 times. Mm-hmm. And so the volunteer opportunity turned into an entrepreneurial social business that now is thriving, and he's gotten a lot of prizes, and he's really expanding and the work he's doing. And another case, one of my colleagues on the Presidential Advisory Council of Rwanda, he considers himself a half-timer. So his first half of his career was going out there, building his career, and then he got to a point where, well, how can I just be of service to humanity? I achieved what I wanted to achieve for myself. And so then he started by volunteering and contributing and creating scholarship opportunities, and then he said, you know what? I'm creating all of this. How do I actually allow the people that I'm getting scholarships for to come back, create their own enterprises, and create spaces for them to move forward? So he's actually now creating enterprises in this other half of his life. So I think what we have to realize is the volunteering experience can actually be a scoping phase that can lead to innovation, to entrepreneurial solutions, to new ways of going about it that we didn't think about. And because of the pressures of work and deadlines and whatever we need to meet, we didn't allow ourselves to think outside the box. So the volunteering can be a new space to tap into that.
I think we have to be explicit that to realize these innovative opportunities, we have to let go of our existing prejudices. And we have prejudices in multiple directions. We can't have this conversation without saying ageism, without saying racism, without saying the preconceptions that people have about other people based on their identities. And the innovative opportunity that I believe is before us is that sort of as a global world, notwithstanding the horrible, horrible exceptions to it, how can I say as a global world, we're moving beyond prejudice when genocide is a reality today. But the horror at genocide is also a reality today, and it can't happen in secret as it used to. The daylight that social media and connectivity places on what's going on in the world is one of the ways that we're going to get beyond prejudice and in the direction of innovation. And another way, I need to revise my previous remark about the role of government. I sat there and was like, oh, God, I can't believe I said that. There are a couple things that I need to say. There's do-overs. There are so do-overs. That's what the whole thing's about. There's doing over and over and over, in point of fact. That we have to set a framework in government that makes the discrimination that follows from such prejudices impossible. We have to set a framework in government that unties benefits and pensions and those incentives from the patterns of work. We're moving in that direction, but we have to finish that job and move in that direction. And we have to set an environment where people are protected for their good performance is the basis of their reward and the basis of their retention and the basis of their opportunity, and that they're protected in a way so that that can be true.
So let's move from government to politics. I said there are no do-overs in politics because there are no do-overs in politics. I'm interested in what this new demography of the United States is going to mean for politics, because I'm interested in where people are going to live and where they're going to vote and who they're going to vote for. One of the things that we saw in the 2012 election was how divided the nation is according to where people live. And these very blue cities, wherever they may be, surrounded by these increasingly empty red spaces. And what's going to happen when you can live to 120? Are you going to live to 120 in rural Mississippi, or are you going to move to a city? What's this going to do to our political system moving forward? You have to have thought this through.
There's so many angles to take on that, you know, to come from. But I mean, I think it's a good one. I think that, again, you know, relevance and to, you know, start with your very first part of your question. You know, what is the government going to do? What has it impact politics? Is, you know, this is on the top of everybody in Washington's mind, is understanding the demographics and what are the changes and what does it mean to folks. And like I said, it's a fact. They're happening each and every day. The numbers are guaranteed. The question is, what does it mean? And so I think that what you're starting to see is people really driving in and saying, okay, what does that mean? And how do I deliver and experience that accountability that I started with? How am I accountable for creating a world that resonates and is relevant to the people who may be voting for me? So I think that's what's happening out there. You know, the Global Coalition on Aging has been really pioneering and kind of leading the charge on making this something that everybody knows about, right? It doesn't come into every single day dialogue, but it's going to, right? And so I think that we're going to see a lot more of this kind of conversation, and you're going to have a lot of opinions out there of what it actually means on that front.
Andrew?
I think with the changing demographics, politically speaking, to get to your question, I think we've visibly seen the impacts of how we communicate with one another in terms of politics, in terms of relating with constituents and relating with our leaders. I think of Dr. Barbara Kellerman at Harvard, Kennedy School of Government, who's written extensively on how leadership is changing, but also how politics has changed, because in the age of social media, accessibility is not based on power or position. But one tweet in Egypt, need I say more, can snowball and truly take down institutions of power that have existed for decades. And so in terms of government and politics, I think our systems have to rethink how they relate to their constituents, how they lead, that it's not just based on position and the title that is behind my name, but it's ultimately, am I doing the job for those that have elected me to serve, and am I recognizing their needs in a two-way fashion, not just a one-way fashion. So I think it's important to keep in mind.
That's a good point. It's a fantastic point, which kind of goes back to some of the other things that we were saying before, which is, I think if you look fast forward 10 years, I think the most successful people in life are the ones who are going to have the best relationships, and as we've said, are going to be multi-generational. Therefore, it's really incumbent upon everybody, whether they're old dealing with younger folks, young dealing with older folks, to kind of figure out that it's not just about the one club, that I'm going to use, that's in the golf. It's how do I use all of these? How do I use social media? How do I use the phone? How do I interact with you face to face? So I think it's kind of a rounding out of that that's going to make a huge difference.
And how, of course, does it change over the course of time, right?
Right.
I mean, wasn't it, I'm going to butcher this, I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm going to apologize in the beginning, but I think it was Churchill, right, who had that line about a man under 30 who is not a liberal lacks heart. A man over 30 who is not a conservative is an idiot. And imagine a world in which you live to 120, the contours of your political life, what you care about, what matters to you. That's going to be interesting to see.
But it is not a natural law that people grow more conservative.
No, this is what I'm saying.
Right.
It could switch back.
Right.
That roaring, those red 110s.
Right.
Yeah.
It is, and we have to recognize that in this country, the growing diversity in the country and the relationship between the diversity in the country and who's aging. So that in New York City, for example, the number of people of Hispanic, and I apologize because, of course, that's a census term, it's not a culturally real term, people who are older will double in the next 10 years. The number of African American and people of African and Caribbean descent, people in this city who are old, will increase by 50%. The number of people who hail from the Asian continent and subcontinents will more than double in the next 10 years. And the number of white Americans who are older in New York City will decrease slightly in the 7 to 10% range. So the characterizations that we have about the political affiliations of older people are a description of a previous cohort.
Right.
They're not a description of a future cohort. That's one thing. And then the second thing is that we know politically urban areas and suburban and rural areas are quite different from one another. And more older people are wanting to stay in urban areas if that's where they were, and go to urban areas if that isn't where they were, which I don't know if that renders a transformation in politics or is caused by one.
Well, it's a very good thing for the urban area.
Yeah.
It's a less good thing for the rural area that
Yes.
sees its population continue to decrease and decrease. It's funny about the notion of passing into a new cohort of age, because that's going to necessarily change as well. This idea that a 65-year-old is old is already kind of specious, right?
Well, it's the same thing you said earlier about the 30-year-old still living at home.
Right.
In today's world, is that really 30 or is that 20?
Yeah. Golly. Are you sick of my questions? I am a little bit. I'm not so good at this. There are a lot of people who are very good at it out in the web world, and they've been following us on Twitter, and I hope our Twitter streams have been raging. And I see there are a few people out here who have been kind of moved to speak but have not spoken because of the social niceties of this tiny room that we're in. So I think what would be great is if we could take a few questions, if that's all right, both questions from the wide world and questions from the audience, and please direct them to us. Sir?
I'm 83 years old, and I'm from Chicago originally, Irish Roman Catholic back of the stockyard, and through a variety of circumstances ended up spending time in this wonderful city where I'm going to be prayed out feet first. I think one of the things that isn't discussed at these meetings yet for me has been the influence of faith-based living, because many people, in my experience, this is just a pass-through. getting ready to go to eternal happiness. So the job we have in changing our attitude and behavior about life itself, and not whether we're going to go up or down. And I've never heard from either place in 83 years or something. But it is a concept that people live by. And I believe in the spiritual life, but I don't necessarily buy that this is an end in itself, living here, and we don't emphasize that. The other thing I think about it is, I wish we'd begin emphasizing the word benefits rather than entitlements. I think that is it's turned into something ugly. Thank you.
That is true. It has been, those words have been brickbats in our political life, but David has assured us that in either event, they're gone. So plan early. Oh, who's up?
So
Can I say that it's fantastic that we have a wired mic?
I had the privilege to be accompanied here with some high school students from Life Science Secondary School, 96th Street. And I just wanted to kind of expand the debate a little bit and ask about the role of women in all this, specifically since male achievement gaps are really interesting right now as far as like how males are developing and achieving or not achieving. And so the role of women, one, and also the income gap. What are those two phenomena going to do to this conversation and to the reality of our future?
The income.
Yes. So the question is, how are the issue a gender gap and the income gap that comes out of the gender gap going to affect this discussion moving forward?
Well, I think one of the interesting things I see happening in Canada is there are more and more women going to university, and then there are less young men going to university. So one of the things that's happening is in terms of people who have higher degrees, there's a shift that's happening in the population. And that shift will change income gaps. The other thing I think that's happening that I found really interesting was when instead of celebrating Valentine's Day, there is the 1 billion people rising against violence against women around the world. And I think there are events in 190 countries around the world. So I think the power of women to create spaces for people to meet and to engage society to look at the violence that exists and think about how we interact differently is a powerful platform that can be used not only in terms of how we relate to each other as human beings, but also how do we relate to the planet and how are we treating the planet. So violence against each other, but also violence in terms of are we taking care of the earth we're living on. And so I see the role of women moving forward as really exciting, and I see it actually decreasing the income gap.
Yes?
Can I just say
Just speak really loudly.
This is for David, and it's really simple. Kind of at the beginning, you said that what we need in today's world to get us along is connections, and I didn't get the second part.
What I was saying is that there's safety. What we've learned from all the different focus groups that we do in providing our product and services to folks is that there's this new generation that's finding safety in the connections and the fact that we're moving away from this world where it was kind of one income family and you kind of did it to this need for a plan, and the connections and the partnering has become important. It falls right into the women conversation as well. Some of the things that we learned, which was pretty interesting, was that if you go back to that original kind of view, the shift that took place was the promises that I said. You go do this, and you get this, and you do this, and you get this. Well, if now you're on your own and plans become better, you have to actually start looking into the psychology of men and women, right? Women are really good at putting the plan together. What is the goal? What are the actions? And are we monitoring those things? They're better than most men on that front. And that's becoming much more important, so you're seeing this tag team approach. But it's the connections, and that connections come in the form of the partnership.
I just want to expand on that connections idea and say that it's a critical idea across the life course. in disasters, which, you know, here in the city, we're sort of attuned at the moment to the reality of disasters. The people who are the most vulnerable to death in a disaster are those people who are the least connected. So, and this has been reproduced over and over again around the world. So there's a famous study in the Paris heat wave that happened a decade ago. There was very high mortality of a group of older adults, and they were the ones who were isolated in France, where the culture was, this was in August, their kids were away on vacation. And they were alone, and those who had friends and depth of connection survived, and those who didn't died. The heat wave occurred in neighboring Spain, and there wasn't mortality because the connectedness was just more integral to the culture. This basic idea was reproduced in the Chicago heat wave and is again occurred in Hurricane Sandy here. It's the people who are isolated, who are concentrated in older people, but not only older people, who literally don't survive in an unplanned disaster, and those of us with multiple connections who do.
Okay, so we need to take a Twitter question, because I suspect there are people here who believe that no one is on the other end of that camera, that camera is a fake camera. But I believe, I haven't checked with Twitter, but I believe there's a Twitter question out there. Is there?
Yes, we're here to prove them wrong. We have a question. Is the challenge in the northern hemisphere mirrored in the southern hemisphere?
Okay, who's that from?
They didn't tell me.
It's got to have like a little
who you
@
are.
sign?
I know.
Okay, next, whoever's feeding those to us, we need some @ signs. We need to know where these things are coming from because it's kind of fun. All right, who's gonna land that northern southern hemisphere?
Okay,
good.
One of the things that's happening is that we have more countries building wealth. So the issues we're talking about here that are happening in North America, these are lessons for other countries that are emerging in terms of wealth of their populations. And one of the issues, for example, that's happening in Africa is the #1 killer of people who are executives. So in their career, at the prime of their, that path we said in terms of what used to be, they're dying of heart disease and diabetes. And so what we have as the leaders of society are being affected by health issues that, you know, are not HIV, are not tuberculosis, are not malaria, but are diseases of wealth, which is, are we taking care of our bodies? Are we in communication and interconnected so that our souls, our hearts, our psychology is strong and helping us to fight off diseases? And so what we're seeing in the North is reflected in the South. It's not as extreme, but it's happening. And one of the things, when I go back to my local and global, is that everything that we learn from in one place will have applications elsewhere. So knowing that is also knowing that for the students out there who are watching us and thinking, well, you know, how do I contribute? It's the reality that whatever you're learning can be of benefit to people around you, and you may not know it, but also to people across the world. And so remembering that you have value no matter what you're studying.
I think I just want to point out that while diabetes and heart disease in Africa are a disease of wealth, in the United States they're diseases of poverty. And that this is one of the things that we need to be mindful of as we look around the world. They have the same source, fatty, processed foods, but in some emerging nations, those are signs of wealth. In the United States, signs of poverty. That was just a footnote, journalist guy.
It's a very interesting thing. There's a I believe he's Swedish. Don't hold me to it. Hans Rosling has a video on YouTube, if you actually go look at that, and it's the history of the world, and it plots it by country, health and wealth. Oh, wow. And it actually shows the entire history of the world and how countries rise and fall and the types of diseases. So as the wealth rises, the disease change. It's an unbelievable video.
See, it would be really cool right now if someone could tweet the link to that and we could play it right here. And I bet we could, and I bet if someone will tweet that link to me at Sam Sifton, I would appreciate it. So I don't have to go through the business of looking.
I could play it on my iPhone, but everybody's going to have to gather around.
Gather close, everyone. All right, let's take another question. Sir.
Sorry.
Oh, she's got the microphone.
I have the mic. I have the power. I'm the leader. But to refocus back on the leadership development question, which I think wasn't touched on so much, for the last several years, I've helped lead a number of panels at ILA around millennials and understanding millennials better. And one of the things that have come up in that multi-year exploration has been this idea of the crucible experience in shaping a leader as they grow and develop. And one of the things I think is really fascinating is there are some things that shape someone as a crucible experience regardless of the era. So a parent dying or some other kind of severe loss possibly. But what I'm seeing with young people, you'd mentioned, Andrew, stress. How is that going to affect people down the line? We see a big rise in teen pregnancy in New York City. There's been talk of that recently. So is there different crucible experiences that the new generations are going to go through, and maybe at different ages, for example, entering their late 20s, early 30s when their parents need care, which we haven't necessarily encountered before. But what will the impact of different kinds of crucible experiences or at different ages, how will that affect our future leaders and the way they think about things?
Good question. Andrew?
Back to the work of Dr. Jeffrey Arnett, who I mentioned earlier, in the school of thought behind emerging adulthood, that as we are aging longer, retiring later, we're also becoming adults later. And it's not a widely held belief, or at least I don't think that the population at large has been able to put a name to that reality. So I think in terms of crucible experiences, thank you for mentioning that, because I too am a leadership development person. I think crucible experiences in this day and age are more and more they're more and more happening when individuals actually become adults. And so the work out of Clark University shows that financial sustainability, financial sufficiency is really outweighing any other previous rite of passage, whether it's moving out of the home, whether it's getting married, whether it's buying a house. More and more are identifying that stage of I've reached adulthood when they are financially able to provide for themselves, have a sufficient job, have a sufficient income. And so I think those crucible experiences are very much experiential, but I think are very much more times than not these days dictated by the world. Because if it's a job change, if it's a layoff, if it's finally finding that niche of career where you think you might be able to contribute. We talked about kind of job changes. Emerging adults are looking for where they fit. And sadly, more times than not, they're trying to fit through organizational structures and organizational norms that don't allow that. And so I think the challenge for leadership is significant in that aspect.
Can I just press you on this for a second?
Please.
So the study you're citing says that the crucible experience for millennials is being self-sufficient?
Identifying themselves as an adult.
Yeah, so okay, I got you. Right. And yet that's difficult to do because society is stacked against that happening.
I think the day and age that most millennials find themselves in, whether they're living at home, whether they're still looking for a job.
Not living at home.
No, of course. I think those realities of today are adding to that.
Got it.
I don't want to say stacked against, but challenges to navigate.
Well, you're either financially self-sufficient or you're not.
Sure.
So, and if you're living at home, you're not. Right. So, okay, I got it.
But if you talk about financially self-sufficient, in this world, it's not just you.
Right.
The biggest, if you're financially self-sufficient, chances are you're taking care of your kids as well and your parents. And, there's a lot that you might be faced with.
Yes. Yes, there is. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My question, first of all, I want to thank the panel for wonderful observations. When I think of intergenerational relationships, Ruth mentioned the great need for attachments. David, you mentioned about the need for all kinds of skills, particularly behavioral skills. And it seems to me that when you look at young people, what they really need most is how to avoid the mistakes that the older people made, and also coping skills to cope with losses and setbacks and disasters in life that older people have already learned. So it seems that the key is really communication between the generations. So I'd like you panelists to come up with your best suggestions on how we can increase communication and mentoring between the generations.
I think storytelling is a key component of this. You know, we spend a lot of time, and I can only speak personally, we spend a lot of time in, you know, my household with my 4 kids, kind of talking about lessons learned, sayings that my parents used to say, things that we messed up on, you know, those type of things. You know, one that, and don't think less of me for this one, but this is, you know, early in my career, I had just started work. I lived about 40 miles away from my parents. I had moved out. I had done well the first year, and I had been given a promotion, and I got a raise. And so I kind of jumped in the car, raced up to my parents' house, and kind of bragging about, hey, I just got this big promotion with what I thought was a big title, and I got a raise. And I was talking to my father about it in his workshop, and he said, I started actually complaining. Yeah, they only gave me this amount. You would have thought it would have been bigger. And he actually took a ruler, a yardstick, and he flipped it over to me, and he goes, point to me where you are in your career on this yardstick. And he goes, not until you're about the halfway mark do I ever want you to be complaining about money. You're still learning. You're learning how to cope with people. You're learning how to contribute. Now, once you start really kind of making that impact, now you can start thinking on the money side of things. But we tell stories like that in our household all the time, and it's kind of my way of passing things on, you know, from the things that I've learned. So I think storytelling is a huge part of this. Become a really good storyteller.
Passionate engagement. I feel that what we've learned is that it's by people working together to build something, to make something, to change something, to do something, that they really learn from each other. Not to differ with my esteemed colleague on the end, but I don't think you tell people how to be. I think you be how you want them to be together, and that you're needing to work on something together. One of the wonderful things about doing aging work in New York City is that the activists that made our city what it is, the civil rights activists, the feminist activists, the housing rights activists, the, you know, human rights activists, are now, the union activists, are now older people who have this bank of knowledge and expertise and wisdom that a younger generation needs desperately. The tools may be different, but the objectives and the values and the skills can be shared. And that, to me, is how that transfer of skills happens, is by doing something together.
Can we go to a Twitter question?
Sure. There's two from the University of Washington who want to know how are you preparing the next generation for this new workforce? What courses do that?
That seems more than 140 characters. It does, that may have been. That's a lot. That's a big. I know, and they're sending it. They're sending in the emails. Andrew, you want to were there recently in the university place.
So. Recently, it's been a few years, but I think the biggest impact for an undergraduate student in the life of their education and the life of their programs, no matter if it takes 4 years, as was mentioned earlier, or 5 or 6 or 7 years, as is the case in the state of California, due to budget cuts and availability for classes. That's a whole nother topic for a great panel maybe in the future. I think that the greatest benefit there is the experiential learning that's already been mentioned before. Not to beat a dead horse with the value of internships, but internships, fellowships, volunteering that's been mentioned previously, engaging in the life of organizations and community groups that give an idea as to what could a future look like in that sector, in that field, in that industry, because it's a great opportunity to explore, to consider what's out there and to consider what opportunities best fit your skills and your strengths. So, great question.
Another real life question? Yes, ma'am?
Yes. In Ruth's vein here, I'm just astounded that we are in a generation, all of us here, the millenniums and the boomers, we are all together, and no time ever in the world have we been in this situation. No time ever. I, as a boomer, started learning how to type on a manual typewriter. Someone asked me, what's a manual typewriter? And went to an electric typewriter, went to one computer, went to another place, it was a different computer. And yet there are young people who don't even know how to sign cursive their name. We are at, I think, a wonderful place. I mean, I even saw on a PBS, there was a program that showed the Earth from space, and it was a live transmission, and I was thinking, oh my God, I'm there. I'm on there. No one ever in reality had ever seen that. And we are in this generation, all of us, the young, the old, and I think it is offering an extremely beautiful advantage for us to create going forward for us to live together, to work together, to encourage each other, and we're just lucky with that advantage. Never before.
No question there, but that's an awesome statement, and I'm glad that you made it, because it allows me to say that I was talking to my daughter about looking for a phone booth, and she said, "What's a phone booth?" And I was flabbergasted, and I remembered, and I wish that my grandparents were still alive so that they could say, "Well, I remember when you said, why do you call it an icebox?" Sir.
If I can, that's a great point to make. Just to go back to what David was mentioning earlier about storytelling, I think there is great value whenever we, no matter what generation we come from, have a sense of an intentionality to ask good questions of each other. I think more and more as of late in my own experience, in my own journey, the value of a good question is probably the most understated, underestimated, undervalued thing.
Keeps us in business.
Exactly.
Exactly. This is not a new discussion. The points you made, which I love the points you made, you labeled it as technology at one point of that. That's been happening forever and ever.
Tell us what it was like when there were horses.
Somebody once was telling me the story of the biggest arguments that Socrates used to have about technology. And I was like, what do you mean? They didn't have technology. Sure they did. It was called writing the stories down. Because the value that was done back then was how great of a storyteller you were, and it always was kind of came from within. And now you're writing it down, that's going to wreck it all.
Yeah.
There's something around who we see as leaders in the world. I mean, right now, we're having this event that's webcast, and if we think about who are the technology leaders out there, I mean, there are a lot of young faces out there, and those young faces are determining how we are all going to decide to harness our interconnectedness. And so just that space of what young leaders in the world, and the power they have to shape how we are going to be communicating and continue to communicate, is a really important space to look at in terms of the youth gap, or in terms of, okay, when am I going to get that job, is am I tapping into my creativity so I create my own job, or am I hoping that someone is going to give me something? And I think one of the challenges for youth today is really believing in themselves enough to start their own spaces in terms of creating new organizations that are much flatter. Because it was interesting listening to conversation around organizations, and then I was thinking about all the tech companies and how they relate to each other. And I thought, this is not describing how these organizations are working. And so we have different types of organizations that represent these different generations and represent the evolution we've had over the last 100 years of how we work together as humans. And so one of the things is, how are we harnessing that in terms of creating new leadership spaces for youth so that they can engage and so that all other generations can engage and tap into the new spaces that are being created?
Another question? Yes, ma'am? Oh, I'm sorry. We got to do it via mic. I'm not in charge of who the next question is. That's an unaccustomed feeling for me. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm a senior in high school right now. I go to life sciences. And, well, we know about this scarcity of jobs because it's graying of America. And I was wondering, like, how is immigration impacting this scarcity of jobs? Like, what is the government gonna do, like, in order for this, in this topic, sorry. Yeah, that's just my question, like, how immigration, the role of immigration.
You know, it's a weird thing, because people kind of believe that immigration, you know, the popular belief is that immigration makes it harder to get jobs, right? Is that what you were thinking? Yeah.
We all know that we have to better ourselves to compete with working. But how is it going to be like in the future? How are we going to get jobs?
Right.
That's what I want to get out of this.
Right.
That all we're talking about is we have to do this and we have to do that. But then how do we apply that?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's debunk the myth that immigration is the problem, because it's not. The clear evidence shows that immigration is not related to loss of jobs in the receiving country. In fact, what happens is the flow of immigrants decreases when the job opportunities are less. The labor market self-regulates better when we don't mess around with it as we do with governments and laws. Boy, I'm taking a weird position today. But let me turn directly to you. You're saying, I came to this panel because I'm worried about what I should do to prepare myself to get a job, right? Is that what you're saying? Right. Well, I think I have colleagues better qualified to answer this, but let me give you my 2 cents, which is the best thing that will prepare you to get a job is to do work. Get yourself into a workplace setting as a volunteer, as an intern, in a structured relationship and engagement with a workplace. That's a thing that employers will look at in a positive way, and it's a thing that'll get you understanding how to present yourself to employers in a positive way. Now I'm going to turn it over to experts.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time together in this little room, and I want to get as many questions in as we can. Sir?
Before Steve speaks, just a reminder for folks out in the virtual world, the Twitter hashtag ILANYT, all caps. Thank you.
Okay, question that does follow up on this gentleman's questions about jobs, and it relates primarily to the nonprofit sector and opportunities for talented people. I'm from Boston, and actually I teach in a graduate program, a leadership program, and a number of students are interested in nonprofit careers. Now, there's a interesting trend phenomenon, which I think is exciting, and it has to do with Encore careers. And there's a great organization called Encore.org, based in Boston, but it's doing great things for people who are approaching retirement and going to be living another 15, 20 years and want to do something meaningful. What's happening, and we're seeing this in Boston, and I suspect New York City and other areas, is that people in the corporate sector, nonprofit sector, whatever, who are reaching my age, are looking to continue to do something meaningful and contributory. So Encore.org and a variety of other organizations are helping create opportunities in nonprofits. Whether they're pro bono, minimal pay, whatever, it's exciting. But the conundrum on the other side is that there are a lot of young people coming out of graduate schools, passionate about working in nonprofits, but with nonprofits thinning down in opportunities, the pipeline of movement up or the pipeline getting in is kind of stunted. Now, it's more than just anecdotal. In Boston, a professor has done a study on this with nonprofits. So it's kind of a dilemma, and it's not causing friction between generations, but it's, I think, a major issue, especially for nonprofits. So just want your thoughts on that in terms of young talent who want to go into a field. The number of opportunities are significantly diminished. And if a nonprofit has the opportunity to get somebody very skilled with seasoned experience, maybe at lower pay, that might be at the expense of somebody who needs experience and is the future leadership of these organizations.
Excellent question. Who wants to grab that? Yes, sir.
Take the first part of it. Your Encore careers, love it, very well acquainted with it. Some people call them second acts, encore careers, etc. The one thing I would add to your comments on that is that it's driven by two reasons. One is some people have to do it. Some people have not prepared, and they're facing now a longer life, and what they have to rely upon is their own human capital in order to make sure that they're living the best lives that they possibly can. The second piece of it is what we've been talking about here. People who actually are thriving on the network, the connections, your whole second act of who am I going to relate to and how does that feel so I'm not isolated out there. And that's a huge driving force behind what's going on there. So it's nice to know that it's not just out of the necessity piece of things.
Right, but then now that job has been taken, it's gone. You don't have a job now because somebody in their second act took it from you. Psych. What do we do about that?
Go. Are they really the same kind of jobs, though?
One of the things
in the nonprofits, apparently.
Maybe.
We'll see. Yes.
If we go back to the subject of leadership and what is the vision you have for yourself, and I think one problem that sometimes happens is that people do not work at developing that vision of what they see they can best contribute and how that can show up. And I think if we start out saying there's competition, we are not focusing on our creative uniqueness. And if we focus on our creative uniqueness, then we create opportunities for ourselves and people tend to want to work with us. And so I think it's really important in terms of what are the mindsets we bring into our careers in terms of seeing opportunity or scarcity. Because the reality is there are a lot of problems in the world that need solving, which means all of those problems, until we've solved them all, those are all opportunities that we have not figured out how to turn into profitable spaces where we can have thriving careers. And so that's where the focus, in my opinion, needs to be.
Sir?
I'm currently pursuing a PhD in leadership, and it seems like one of the generational gaps that I'm seeing is as soon as anyone hears that, I often get, and what are you going to do with that? And how are you going to make money and things like that? And it seems like since 2008, a lot of students are going to school in order to learn a trade or in order to be able to make money. It seems like that seems to be the biggest concern with parents is, yeah, you can pursue an art degree, but I need you out of my house. And in doing so, it seems like our prolonged ages may be making people take careers that may not be best suited for them in the long run.
it's kind of, I think it speaks to the notion of what is leadership and what are the values of the leadership piece of things. And I do think those things are changing. I can tell you from our standpoint, I've been in the corporate world for 20 some odd years. And when we try to grow leaders within our organization, we've taken a little bit of a non-traditional approach where we don't bring in, leadership gurus who do this as a living. I'll give you an example. We just had 350 folks who we think are true future leaders of our organization, and the guest speaker was a Medal of Honor winner. It has nothing to do with corporate America in the traditional sense, but there are 79 Medal of Honor winners living in the world today. There's less than 400 who've ever gotten it. Those are true leaders. And if you kind of go in and you understand what drove them, it's things like passion, it's things like empathy for others, it's things like accountability and responsibility. So I think the world of how people are looking at leadership, to your point, is changing. It might be changing slow, but I think it is changing.
We got to stick with our Mike Speaks program. Sir.
Hi. I appreciate everyone's comments. And some of the themes I'm hearing, they do make sense to me. Planning, adaptability, et cetera. And I think those things can foster intergenerational dialogue and collaboration. My fear, though, is that the rhetoric shifts to what we just heard, entrepreneurial spirit, and it puts the onus on the individual. And it's not to say that the individual doesn't have a role, but let's face it, there are systemic and institutional inequalities, not just in this country, but around the world, that are bigger than any individual or even groups of individuals. And I think Ruth earlier was mentioning the problems that come with a climate of disaster. And you might think of a natural disaster like Hurricane Sandy, or a disaster that erupts out of human malice like 9/11. But in some ways, the system in which we live, predatory capitalism, or what Naomi Klein has called disaster capitalism, that too haunts all of us. And it's a systemic creation of our entire society. So unless we acknowledge that and talk about ways of changing these things on an institutional and systemic level, you can be as entrepreneurial as you want, but you may still end up a casualty among other casualties.
I see you.
No, that's a really great point. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how do we as individuals have a sense of what our vision is so that we connect to others that have similar visions and we can move forward together in community. And that community can be a nonprofit, it can be a for-profit, it can be government, it can take all sorts of forms. But one of the issues I have when I talk to young people, it's like, what are you passionate about? How can I help you get where you want? And if that reflection, that inner reflection hasn't happened, it's really hard to help people get into the places of passion where they would thrive because they have not allowed themselves to think about that. And I'm not saying it's easy. Clearly, some people have a lot of privilege and some people have a lot less. I think one of the issues is the people who are on the margins. How do we amplify those voices so that there's greater awareness collectively of what they're going through and our responsibility as a community to support them to thrive? Because their thriving determines our thriving. You know, you talked about the different types of disasters in 9/11. The reality is, if we want peace in the world, we can't just hide behind our, beautiful golden gates that protect us. There's nothing that will protect us from that outer world. That outer world is a reflection of how much compassion we have for what's outside of ourselves. And so I think in order for that space of peace to grow, it's really critical that we help each other. But in order to help each other, we have to start with clarity of what do we really want for ourselves.
We're going to take just a couple more questions because then we have to go put out the greatest newspaper in the world, the New York Times. I hope you have subscriptions and you can look. Sir?
I want to get back to where we sort of started at the beginning about how the increased longevity around the world is a fact, and I think it's a fact we're all happy about, that we're living longer than people did 100 years ago. That presents opportunities and it presents challenges. And one of the challenges that Ruth mentioned earlier is age discrimination. I mean, yeah, we know it's a fact. We know ARP showed studies that people may be the last to be let go, but it takes them longer to be rehired. We know that there's age discrimination in the workplace. In fact, my wife just edited a book on this, about this at a national level. But the other thing that also bothers me, and what can we do about it? The other thing that really bothers me about this panel is we've talked about the college student. Well, what about the other 50% of this country? What are we going to do for them? What has happened to social responsibility or corporate responsibility? We know these studies out of Boston College, how much little money people are putting into the 301ks, 401ks, whatever they are. What kind of future do they have? What are we doing for the high school graduate so they will have a future? And again, this is social responsibility. People in this audience, the young people probably don't remember, 15 years ago, we were talking about no national debt, no need for a 10-year bond, yet we made political decisions to do unfunded wars, unfunded Medicare benefits, and now we're paying the price and now we're complaining. As Pogo said, the problem is us. And one of the things I look forward to is the retirement of Grover Norquist. Thank you.
Does someone want to grab that? I mean, it's a big issue.
It's a big question.
I mean, we've been looking at it all day.
Right.
You know, it's not simply the will of the individual to succeed.
That's exactly right. It's not the will of the individuals to succeed. And the kind of assumption that's been bubbling up in the last part of the conversation, that there's something about intergenerational interdependence that is inherently conservative or available only to one class or speaking to one color or in favor or opposed to a level of governmental responsibility. I will challenge you that those are assumptions themselves, based on assumptions about who older people are and what we're talking about here. And I will put forward the proposition, as I've tried to, I think, that one of the most dynamic engines for change for good is to harness the experience and the values and the skills across generations to demand that the government continue to maintain its responsibilities at the same time that corporations and not-for-profits eliminate practices that are discriminatory and promote practices that are inclusionary and visionary. And I think that's what we're talking about in this panel.
That was extraordinarily well-played answer, I think. I really do. And I wish that that was the last question, because we'd go out on a huge round of applause, and we probably should. Oh, you get it anyway. You get it anyway. Should we take one last question, and then we'll try again with the applause and try and make it a little bit bigger, because these guys worked very hard.
Why don't we take one from the online audience?
Oh, great.
Which sectors can be most positively impacted by the increasing generational diversity in the workforce? All of them.
All of them is the answer, probably.
Nonprofit sector, I think earlier it was identified that more and more new professionals are desiring to go into the nonprofit sector. I tag on to that and say nonprofit means a lot, from the average 10 to 12 person nonprofit that I started out with to a 45,000 employee international organization like World Vision. So I think it's an important thing a statement rather to make in terms of the
all right, so nonprofit, that's one possibility.
I think the opportunity inherently there, community-based nonprofits, is great for generations to come alongside together. Much is still already what's been said in terms of service and volunteerism.
I wouldn't put my chips on any one. I'd put them all across the board.
All right.
There's a division in skills and experience, so that about half of people work in knowledge-based industries in New York now, and about half of people work in service-based industries, and both of those two are seeing growths in older adults and will continue to.
Eliane, sector of the future?
Actually, I'd like to turn the question around. Is how do we ensure that all sectors use the strengths of each generation in the most effective way to move society in a more peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous space for all?
Again, with the crazy good answer. That's good. Okay, folks, seriously, the sector that's going to really matter in the 21st century is journalism, and I hope that you will all subscribe to the New York Times and stay subscribers to the New York Times for the rest of your extremely long lives. Thank you for joining us here at the Times.